So now we want to take you back to the floor of the House of Representatives, where right now lawmakers are debating the GOP plan to repeal and replace Obamacare. The bill cleared the House Rules Committee earlier, and votes are scheduled to begin in about 30 minutes.
Well, last night, President Trump issued an ultimatum to House Republicans saying pass the health care bill today, or Obamacare will remain in place.
Meanwhile, our latest CBS News head count shows that at least 35 Republicans plan to vote no on the bill. The White House and House Speaker Paul Ryan need 13 of those holdouts to actually change their mind for the legislation to pass. If not, it's going to fail.
Let's bring in Mark Leibovich. He's a CBS News political contributor and chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine, and he is joining us from Washington. All right, Mark, let's begin with this ultimatum issued by the White House last night. What do you make of the now or never approach the president is taking?
I think it's probably partly tactical. I also think, though, that the president himself is very eager to move on from this, certainly win, but also lose. I mean, in some ways, there's certainly some discussion at the White House is that even if this does pass, that will draw out the process much more painfully and longer, certainly, into the Senate. And in a way, I mean, this is both, it makes him look tough in this case, but also allows them to move on quickly if it goes down today. So you do sense that this could be a preemptive look at maybe going right to something like a tax reform plan that they could move to more quickly. But who knows? I mean, I think if there were a few votes that he could change, I'm sure that someone at the White House, probably the president himself, would get on the phone and do some last-minute negotiating beyond the ultimatum.
So what do you think is at stake for the president with this vote? Just how much political capital does he stand to lose if the bill actually fails?
Well, I mean, it's always unclear, especially after the sort of the rocky 50, 60 days he's had to start his presidency, how much political capital he actually has. Certainly a defeat like this would be it would be devastating for him, especially given that he's predicated so much of his political persona on a guy who can make deals, who can bring people together, and so forth. At the same time, there's a sort of a sub-narrative to all this, both on the Hill and also at the White House, which is that if this bill, in fact, does get through the House, it actually could be worse for President Trump and from House Republicans, because it looks, based on the polls we've seen in the last few days, that it's very, very unpopular. It drags the numbers of the incumbents who would be supporting the bill down. And I mean, there's all kinds of headaches involved if it does pass, not least of which is getting it through the Senate. So there are a couple of ways of looking at it, but certainly in the short term and for the ongoing story of the Trump presidency, losing a battle like this would be really, really devastating.
It's interesting. The president in the past has tweeted, going back to 2011, know when to walk away from the table. It's a quote from The Art of the Deal. He also tweeted back in 2013, the worst thing you can possibly do in a deal is seem desperate to make it. That's, again, another quote from The Art of the Deal. But, Mark, your paper, the New York Times, is reporting that President Trump actually regrets dealing with health care before putting out a tax proposal, which perhaps might have been more favorable to Republicans. So you got to wonder, what forces do you think were pushing him to make health care the first priority for the White House?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways the rhetoric around health care over the last 7 years, and certainly during this campaign, created maybe a false assumption among Republicans that this could be done easily and quickly. Obviously, that has not been the case. But I also think the other thing driving this was probably Paul Ryan. I think Paul Ryan certainly convinced Donald Trump and certainly was convinced himself within his own caucus that this would be something that they could do quickly and then move on. Tax reform is no walk in the park either, but it's going to be certainly even more so if they have a defeat under their belt going forward. But I think tax reform is also, it's a topic that President Trump, I think, is more at home with. I think he has bigger thoughts on it. I think this is something that he's thought a lot about. So it's clear, and he's even said this almost explicitly at an event in Nashville last week, that he kind of wishes that he had gotten on to jobs and taxes earlier. So we'll see. I mean, I'm sure if this thing doesn't pass today, there'll be plenty of tea leaves for the recrimination caucus here.
Can we talk a little bit about the Freedom Caucus, which is a group of conservative GOP lawmakers, particularly conservative lawmakers? It certainly seems like the president has been trying to appease them more than the more centrist GOP lawmakers who oppose this bill. But just how much political power does the Freedom Caucus have?
Oh, a great deal, and they've shown that over the last few years. I mean, they have the head of former Speaker John Boehner, on their wall. But I mean, I think I mean, not literally, obviously, but I mean, this is a very influential group, and they work, pretty well as a bloc, and they've been able to shut some stuff down that they feel is that is not consistent with their principles. And they have shown, and certainly the president has shown them a great deal of respect and time, and knows that they can really make or break this thing. To this point, it looks like they've been pretty steadfast against it, although I've heard the last few, maybe 12 hours or so, there is some softening. So we'll see. I mean, I think obviously if that bloc were to go, as a whole, in the direction of the bill, it would be game changing.
Let's go back to Twitter, Mark. The president tweeted this morning, quote, "The irony is that the Freedom Caucus, which is very pro-life and against Planned Parenthood, allows PP to continue if they stop this plan." So do you expect the president to point the finger squarely at those lawmakers if this bill fails? You say they're very powerful. Could they face the brunt of anger from voters?
Well, voters are, I mean, less so. I mean, I think their concern is largely, I think it's probably just trying to be, as deferential as they can to a president who I think that they were pretty predisposed to liking and probably still are. But voter-wise, I mean, these are people who are largely in safe districts. It's hard to think that they're going to be primaried from the center because, I mean, their districts are pretty well drawn out to suit their own ideological background. So it is hard to say and really hard to predict how they would, it's not hard to predict how they would be, punished at the ballot box. But I think more so, this is more a question of pressure from the White House and to some degree pressure from Paul Ryan, who, while they are ideologically not in lockstep with by any stretch, I think he's much better liked at this point and would be much better predisposed to giving them a win than they would be if it were Boehner still.
Well, Mark, Vlad read this tweet that certainly sort of looks like he's pointing the finger at the Freedom Caucus. And we were discussing a little bit earlier, you and I, Vlad, about if this falls apart, will he blame lawmakers? Will he blame, the House GOPs? And what sort of impact that may have on the party? I'm wondering if you think blaming other lawmakers is a smart move on the president's part.
Well, I mean, whether it's smart or not, I mean, it seems to be his MO. I mean, I am pretty confident that if this thing does go down, I mean, there will be a great deal of finger pointing coming from the White House towards Capitol Hill. I mean, the question is, in a weird way, Donald Trump ran as an independent candidate. He seemed very comfortable running against both the Democratic and Republican establishments. Steve Bannon, arguably his top strategist, has made it his, been very explicit, I mean, not recently, but explicit over the last several years about bringing down the Republican establishment, Paul Ryan being chief among them. So, I mean, there is a sentiment, I think, within the White House that Donald Trump himself, as kind of a sui generis political force, is more powerful than anything or any coalition that you could find in traditional Washington, i.e. Capitol Hill. So, I mean, again, though, the question is it's much easier to campaign on, a persona as a singular force trying to come into Washington and clean it up than it is to govern in that way. So, I mean, this is obviously a governing test. It's a legislative test. And I guess we'll see the results for this at the end of the day.
Mark, you made me think of one more question, but real quickly, I mean, is it strange or surreal to have Breitbart coming out against this healthcare plan, and as you point out, Steve Bannon behind the scenes trying to get it done?
Yeah, I mean, it is strange, it is surreal, it is not something you would predict, but at the same time, it does lend credence to the notion that maybe, there are elements in the White House, beginning with Steve Bannon maybe, that don't want this to pass, that believe that the Trump voters, the working class voters, a lot of them, not college educated white voters that gave Donald Trump such, amazing victories in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, would be harmed disproportionately by this bill. And these are Steve Bannon's people. I mean, he has stated that he wants to make this a working class party, a working class movement. And if you look at the numbers, if you look at the polls, and if you look at what this legislation would do, it is not favorable in the camp of these Trump voters. So certainly that could lend credence to that, but I think that there'll be plenty of Kremlinology going forward, especially if this thing goes down to defeat.
All right, Mark Leibovich of New York Times Magazine, thank you so much. We appreciate your insight always.
Thanks, guys.